Earlier this week, Israel announced it would close its embassy in Ireland and recall its ambassador and diplomatic staff. Israel's foreign minister revealed the decision in this post. Today, I have instructed the closure of Israel's embassy in Ireland. The actions, double standards, and anti-Semitic rhetoric of the Irish government against Israel are rooted in efforts to delegitimize and demonize the Jewish state. The Irish government recognized a Palestinian state during attacks on Israel, a move praised by Hamas. Attempted to redefine genocide in international law to support baseless claims against Israel at the ICJ, backed politically motivated cases at the ICC. So they backed international law is his problem with them, promoted anti-Israel measures within the EU and fostered hostility towards Israel. And then he says Ireland is one of the few European countries that hasn't adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And he says Israel will focus its resources on strengthening bilateral relations with countries worldwide according to priorities that also take into account the attitudes and actions of these states towards Israel. So that was the statement of Israel closing their embassy in Ireland. Slightly strange because Ireland wasn't alone amongst European nations in recognizing the Palestinian state after Israel's genocidal war began. Spain and Norway did it too, and they did it on the very same day as Ireland. I don't know why he's sort of lashing out at them, but there's been no close. There hasn't been a threat to close those embassies. Other European countries have also intervened in South Africa's case in the ICJ, including Spain and Belgium. And while Ireland hasn't signed up to the controversial IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, we say controversial is terrible definition of anti-Semitism, nor has Israel's chief military backer, the United States. So it's not completely clear why Israel is singling out Ireland. Ireland's Taoiseach, Simon Harris, had this theory.
I'd respectfully suggest that possibly because it works as a distraction. You're all here today asking me about Ireland's position. What about Israel's actions? What about what Netanyahu is doing to the innocent children of Gaza? This is the diplomacy of distraction. And I think it is deeply regrettable that they took that decision. They have every right to take that decision to close the embassy. I'd rather it didn't happen. We will continue to engage diplomatically. But nobody's going to silence Ireland. I believe in freedom of speech and people are entitled to articulate their views, but they're not entitled to have an alternative set of facts. What's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Gaza is extraordinarily serious. I mean, Ireland's position has been clear on this from day one. We want to see the release of all hostages, absolutely. We condemned the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel, 100%, absolutely, a horrific terrorist attack. But we also know that there are innocent children who are dying, who are being maimed, who are suffering in a way that I'm not sure the whole world can yet even fully comprehend until we see and get into Gaza.
Now, those comments from Harris led to this pretty extraordinary statement from Israel's foreign minister who said this. So he said, Ireland is one of the only countries in Europe that has not adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. They will also hesitate to promote steps to combat anti-Semitism within Ireland. On the contrary, they love it. The words Zionism and Zionists have become derogatory terms in Ireland. They denounced the IDF's actions as war crimes. They crossed all the red lines. Now, in that speech, Saar also referred to Simon Harris as Ireland's anti-Semitic prime minister. That led Irish President Michael Higgins to say this.
I think it is a very serious business to actually brand a people because, in fact, they disagree with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is in breach of so many bits of international law and who has breached the sovereignty of three of his neighbours in relation to Lebanon and Syria, and who would like, in fact, actually to have a settlement in Egypt. I think to suggest that because one criticises Prime Minister Netanyahu, that one is anti-Semitic, is such a gross defamation and slander.
There's not much doubt that Israel breached the sovereignty of Lebanon and Syria, but I'm not sure where Higgins' claims about Egypt is coming from. Perhaps it's a reference to Israel's seizure of the Rafah crossing and Netanyahu's stated desire to have permanent military control of the demilitarized Philadelphia corridor on the Gaza-Egypt border. Sorry, so that definitely could count. At any rate, Israel's foreign minister was happy to put it all down to racism again, saying this. Once an anti-Semitic liar, always an anti-Semitic liar. Ireland's president reached a new low, spewing lies that Israel has breached the sovereignty of three of his neighbours in relation to Lebanon, Syria, and would like, in fact, to have a settlement in Egypt. Now, the claim that the Irish Prime Minister and President's criticism of Israel for the destruction of Gaza and the killing of thousands of Palestinians are motivated by anti-Semitism is obviously absurd, and the idea that the whole country is anti-Semitic is obviously bonkers. Yet some of Israel's volunteer spokespeople are trying to defend it. Online, TV historian Simon Sebag Montefiore linked to an article he'd written for The Spectator in 1997, saying it provided some of the answer to why Ireland is, quote, so weirdly, unreasonably anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. A version of that article has now been republished by the Free Press, called The Deep Roots of Irish Anti-Semitism. It claims that Ireland's hostility to Israel and the Jewish people is nothing new. Of course, that sounds like we're going to get a bold and revelatory history of deep anti-Semitism in Ireland, except we don't. Montefiore focuses on a single case and what's called the Limerick boycott or Limerick pogrom of 1904. It involves a pretty frightening attack by around 300 Irish Catholics in Limerick, riled up by a definitely anti-Semitic priest on the small Jewish community there. It also involved an economic boycott of some in Limerick of Jewish businesses that lasted over 2 years. According to a report at the time by the Royal Irish Constabulary, 5 Jewish families left the area because of the actions, though 26 remained. Montefiore's story is an interesting one. It doesn't make the case he wants it to. So he's saying the deep history of anti-Semitism in this country, this very small incident which occurred more than 100 years ago. Don't just trust us on that. That's also the assessment of another writer who's been trying to make the case for Irish anti-Semitism. Right, so even these guys are fighting amongst themselves. Oliver Sears says, the pogrom in Limerick in 1904, instigated by Redemptorist priest John Cray, is an anomaly, terrifying for the 5 families forced to flee, including Simon Sebag Montefiore's great-grandfather. The violence was nonetheless minor compared to that in Eastern Europe, where pogroms were defined by their murderous brutality. Earlier today, to discuss this story, I spoke to friend of the show, Tyg Hickey, and I began by asking him what he makes of the Irish government's stance.
I wouldn't be a massive fan of our leader's party, Fine Gael. I think they're kind of responsible for all that's wrong in Ireland, to be quite frank. But on this one issue, I think he's been great. Simon Harris has been really clear. He used the term despicable for what the Netanyahu government is doing. And I think he showed a little bit of teeth, which was the right thing to do under the circumstances that are happening right now. I think the backlash is mostly the Zionist bots and the army of bots online. I think myself, I oscillate between believing that there are people who actually consider Ireland to be anti-Semitic because we're tough on the genocidal policies of the Netanyahu government, that they actually believe that because they've swallowed so much propaganda. And then I think there's also people who are just literally being cynical about it and using it as a ploy. And of course, that's true across the board. But I just wondered for a long time, is this something that people would actually consider to be possible, that the reason that Ireland, along with the UN, along with, human rights groups across the board, including human rights groups in Israel, are all simply anti-Semitic, as opposed that we're all outraged, appalled at the behavior of this government, which is doing literally whatever it wants, killing men, women, and children, and daily. So I think it's a form of distraction more than anything else. And I'm actually kind of proud of my government for pretty much the first time in my life that has stood up to the bully boy tactics of the Israeli state. I always believed in the Irish people, and I knew we knew right from wrong, and I knew we do the right thing on this. But actually, the government have been reasonably strong here, and on an international scale, I think it's done us well to stand up to a bully.
So you've had bully boy tactics from the Israeli state, and as you say, sort of Irish politicians have pushed back effectively against that. You've also had some pretty broad, sweeping statements from some prominent British historians, namely Simon Sebag Montefiore, TV historian over here. He's talked about sort of Ireland having deep anti-Semitic roots. This is sort of something that's been essential to your culture for over a century now. What do you make of those sort of claims being made?
It's just ridiculous, like it is just a ridiculous claim. First of all, a big part of that historian's claims, and pretty much, I spent 3 days getting anti-Irish racism and abuse from Zionists, and pretty much their main, reasoning for calling Ireland anti-Semitic is that we were pro-Hitler. We were supposedly a pro-Nazi country, and that has been debunked time and time again. In fact, that historian claims that our leader at the time, De Valera, signed a book of condolences for Hitler. No such book existed. I mean, like, just even a cursory glance at a history book, you would know that that's not true. So this guy, he's lying, and this is what Zionists have to do. You have to lie. In fact, this is what imperialists have to do. You have to lie in order to manufacture consent for the crimes of what you're doing. And it's no different to that. I mean, I also think it's interesting that the Israelis are really tough on Ireland. And I think Ireland is kind of a little bit of an easy target. There was probably a moment in history where the Irish American lobby were some way as strong as the Israel lobby. That moment has clearly passed. The Israel lobby, as you know, effectively runs US foreign policy and has done for a long time, particularly in the Middle East. And so it's interesting that they haven't gone after Spain, for instance, and Norway, who have been equally strong in opposition to this genocidal regime. I think it'd be more interesting for them to go after someone like Spain, a much bigger European country with much greater sway, but it's interesting that they don't. So I think it's a soft target. And most importantly, when you've got historians talking about pogroms in 1904, you've got people talking about Hitler and did De Valera or not sign this fictitious book of condolences, you're distracting from what's actually going on. And what's actually going on is genocidal mass murder on a scale we haven't seen in the modern era. And I think that for a long time has been the Israeli Hasbara policy, which is to distract, get you to look over here so that they continue doing their dirty business in the dark. And we, I think, more than any other European nation, particularly, we're aware of these type of colonial tactics. It's from the exact same colonial playbook that the British used.
Obviously, people disagree whether the Israel lobby control American foreign policy or just influence it, but that's for another conversation, perhaps. We have spoken about this before, but in case this is the first time any viewers have sort of come across you on this issue, I suppose, could you talk a bit about why it's not surprising that Irish politicians and I suppose the Irish public are so behind the Palestinians and opposed to the Israeli genocidal assault on them? Because obviously, Simon Sebag Montefiore is saying, well, the reason the Irish care about this particularly is because they have a particular opposition or dislike or distaste or prejudice against Jews. There is actually a kind of simpler explanation as to why the Irish might be particularly interested in this particular topic. So could you talk about that?
Absolutely. And just one quick thing on the perspective of Irish people being anti-Semitic as well and being pro-Nazi. I mean, tens of thousands of Irish people lost their lives fighting the Nazis. And that was like over and above for a neutral country, because we were neutral because of basically the state of Ireland after the War of Independence with Britain. So there's all sorts of that historical context that needs to be taken into consideration as to why we were neutral. It was a completely wrecked country after breaking free of the empire. But it has nothing to do with anti-Jewishness. It has everything to do with anti-imperialism, I suppose. And the Irish people understand Palestine more than I would say any other European nation, because we get the idea of being dehumanized. We understand what happens when oppressive nations and oppressive people come in and demand that they take over your land, they murder you, all because they feel that they're ethnically or religiously superior to you. So it's the exact same playbook, the dehumanization. We used to have a thing in Ireland called Punch magazine, a British Punch magazine, which would depict Irish people as simian and prone to violence and subhuman. And you get the exact same use of those cartoons against Palestinian people, for instance, in the Washington Post, that famous Washington Post cartoon dehumanizing Palestinians. So we also get being labeled as terrorists for fighting, for using our right by international law to defend ourselves and resist occupation and colonialism. You get labeled terrorists. So we, I think, in our DNA and in our bones, we get the Palestinian cause. But aside from that as well, Michael, it's probably important to say it's just because it's the right thing to do. I believe, and many activists around Ireland believe, that what's happening right now in Palestine, in Gaza, is a right and wrong issue. It's not even about colonial identification and empathy. It's about standing up for what's right and what's just. And I don't think any person who hasn't lost their mind through propaganda or who isn't a psychopath could argue that what Israel is doing now in response to the Hamas attacks is in any way reasonable, fair, or rational. They've broken every international law in the book. So we show solidarity because we understand, we show empathy, we understand what they're going through, but also because it's the right thing to do.
In a way, this reminds you a bit of sort of the left in the Labour Party, sort of when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, sort of being, called anti-Semitic for particular positions on Israel and Palestine. That was, that caused politics to all become quite bizarre. And I suppose, is this having any impact on Irish politics or sort of Irish public debate, the fact that the whole country is being called in one way or another anti-Semitic, or is this water off a duck's back? I mean, how's it being received, let's say?
It's not rattling us anyway, I have to say. We're not like soul searching in any way, shape, or form. And I don't think that's arrogant. It's because I think, if you've spent the last year or more listening to Zionists and Israelis claim that, as I say, the UN is anti-Semitic, all these human rights organizations are anti-Semitic. Twitter is obviously, the gutter, but there have been a couple of amusing tweets of people kind of, reducing it to, I don't like seeing women and children maimed and murdered. And then the response underneath it going, oh, wow, okay, so you're anti-Semitic. And I know that's very reductive and it's ridiculous, but it does feel a little bit like that. There's a childishness to it, even, as well as being malevolent. I think the Israeli position is really childish. I don't know if you saw, but when they announced that they were removing the embassy position in Ireland, they said, oh, do you know what we're going to do now? We're going to go to Moldova because they've been way nicer to us. It's very childish, it's kind of going, we're taking our ball and we're going to play over in Moldova. It's just, so I think we're treating it as more ridiculous than a meaningful reflection on us that we really need to soul search about. Because again, we understand that this is part of the playbook. This is what you have to do. You obfuscate and you distract in order to carry out your war crimes. So to be fair to my country and my people, it's hard to pull the wool over our eyes, really. We've been around the block.